actually have these concerted moments where we pick a topic and we go deep and we really think about the nuance elements and some of the sticky situations that can just surface. All right. I'm also really thrilled that we have Adam Rogers here. Adam comes as deputy editor from Wired. Adam and I used to work together. I'm kind of probably even blushing. It was 2004 when I think about it. And so that means you've been there about 12, almost 12 years?
I think it's 13.
Almost 13 years.
It's like 1,000 years.
Yeah, and it's kind of dog years in journalism. I think maybe throughout the day you might have picked that up from some of the different speakers. It's dog years. But prior to Wired, Adam spent 9 years at Newsweek. And what I love about Adam's background, partly with the role he has now, you know, he's kind of probably very little of the glory and all of the pain if there's ever an issue. If there's ever drama, he's going to have to answer to it. Even if he's like, oh my gosh, it was one of those young undergrads who just graduated and is now, you know, one of our interns or whatever. He has to kind of now answer for all of that. And I think it's one where, as you think in terms of careers where you are and where you might be going, there's always that trajectory and trying to build up that experience because, you know, if all goes well at some point, you get to that point where your experience kind of comes to bear. And I feel really fortunate that we've got Adam to kind of, you know, share that with you. And also the fact that he started as a fact checker, which those of you who've had me in reporting at 609, I'm always saying we don't have enough fact checkers. And what a great way to break into a profession, both from a career perspective, but also just to learn how to do some things well. So I'm going to stop there and let Adam kind of walk you through some of the ethical issues he comes across in his job.
Thank you. If I think I can probably project. If I stand out in front, will the live stream pick it up and you'll be all right with that? Just, this seems awfully formal. You guys have been here for 12, 13 hours now so far. So not only did Laura and I work together a long time ago and for a long time, I don't know if Laura remembers this, but Laura was actually one of the first people who interviewed me for my job when I started at Wired. We went out for a burrito. And I think she tried to talk me out of it, which I'm glad I didn't listen to because it has been a really good 13 years. What I'm hoping to do today is talk a little bit. I might do a little egotistical, like my background stuff, because who doesn't like talking about himself in front of people? And then I have a specific story I want to tell about a specific ethical issue that we handled at Wired, that I handled at Wired about a year ago. Now, 9 months, just as a way of illustrating some of the very clear and simple issues that we face and some of the very complicated and difficult issues that we face, because it kind of encompasses both. And then we may go a little bit broader as I have been thinking about what my role is at the magazine and on the website, and I'll explain that in a second. So I started at Wired as an assigning editor, as the person who deals on the front line with writers. So writers were pitching me, or I was going to writers and trying to give them money to write, usually short things, sometimes feature-length things, for both the front of the book at Wired, the print magazine, and also the feature well. Front of the book is the short stuff at the beginning of the magazine, feature well are the long stories. And I had come off of a fellowship at MIT, and before that, a career at Newsweek that had me start as a fact checker, primarily for their lead science writer, also the medical writer at the time and a tech writer at the time in the mid-90s. So I was the 23-year-old who they hired to explain the internet to them in 1994. Because I was like, I think this might be kind of a useful thing. And all the reporters who I thought of at the time as being very old, and I now realize were probably younger than I am now, were like, oh, thank God. There's going to be somebody who can explain the internet because we think it's probably important too, and we don't even have an AOL account yet. So I actually installed Newsweek's first World Wide Web connection. I went out and bought the router and plugged it in and showed editors. I'm not an IT guy. I don't know how to, I'm not a programmer, but I set that up. That was what the world looked like in 1995. And I covered science and technology, covered the emerging internet for Newsweek, covered the 2000 presidential campaign for Newsweek, ended up in the Washington bureau, turned out to be maybe not the worst Washington reporter in the city at the time, but certainly down there, and split. Nobody tried to stop me when I left and went to this fellowship. And while I was on this fellowship, the Wired job came up. So Wired had started, the first issue came out when I was in graduate school. I went to graduate school in science writing, Boston University. I was sort of I thought I was going to be a scientist who wrote about science, and I broke enough glassware in chemistry class to learn that I was probably going to be a journalist who wrote about science, which was fine because I wanted to be a writer. And while I was in graduate school, one of my professors, in a rare moment of kindness for her, brought the first issue of Wired to me and put it down on my desk and said, "You should work here." And 15 years later or whatever, I was getting interviewed by Laura and her colleagues to go work at Wired because they needed a science editor. And I told them at the time, I've never edited anything. I don't know how to edit. I'm just a reporter. I'm a grunt. So it's what Ulysses S. Grant said when he was asked to describe what a general did. He said, "I'm a verb." But I act, right? So I was a infantry for Newsweek, and got promoted to sort of sergeant when I got to Wired. And they taught me how to edit, I hope. And I stayed at Wired long enough that now my job is one of mostly oversight of other editors. I work mostly online now. I was depending on how you look at these things, number 2 or number 3 on the digital side at Wired, which is now the majority of what Wired does. We still do a monthly print edition, and it's still great, and it's still a Fabergé egg, a perfect object, a monthly, 12 times a year print magazine. But we have this website where millions upon millions of people come every day to look at the same kind of work, but done at a very different pace, a very different way, with a much bigger staff. And now, just because some people have left and because my job has changed, I sort of run that. So what you were looking at is an old print guy who's now working online. And that's new. That's a new world, especially as you all enter it, because my expectation would be primarily you're going to be working online, because primarily that's where journalism happens. So with that as context, about 9 months ago when I was still running, I should interrupt myself to say, you should interrupt me. If you want to ask questions while we're going through, just raise a hand. It's fine. I'm riffing, so it's easy for me to get off track or then get put on track by you. So some months ago, I was, when I was running the digital side science section, something I did for a year and a half or so, I got a DM on Twitter from a writer in China who I really liked. And I was hoping I was going to get her to either freelance for the print magazine, or I had sort of designs in my head that maybe at some point I'd be able to ask her to write regularly for my science section, because having a writer in China would be great. There's a lot of great stories. She was doing really good stuff for both the New Yorker and also for the science section, the news sections of the journals Science and Nature, I think both. I don't know if you've seen those, but if you cover science at all or if you care about it, they do really good news work in the front of those peer-reviewed scientific journals. It's very straight. It's very boring. That's mean. They aren't writing exciting leads. I'm all about exciting leads. They're not so much about that for Science and Nature, but she was doing really good stuff from China. So I was all excited that Christine Larson was actually getting in touch with me. Unfortunately, what she was getting in touch with me to say was, hey, I write a lot for the web. I totally get it. I understand it. But if you guys are going to do a story that directly uses my work, if you could just link back to my stuff, that would be, polite. I would appreciate that, because I'm a fan of Wired. I totally understand her. She was really, really gracious. My response was, sorry, what? Or, what thing did we? How? And I was getting on the bus, messing with my phone. Tell me what you're talking about. And I think we switched to email. I can't remember what. And so Christine said, well, it's these 3 stories, and then here's links. Here's links to my stories. And then here's links to 3 stories that ran online for Wired. And they were all 3 written by a young man who was a fellow, which is what we call an intern now. So it's a paid position. We have 4 or 5 of them every 6 months. And those folks come in and they essentially, there's a lot of scut work in what they do. But they're also acting as staffers, essentially. And Two of them at least are attached to the front of the book, so they're writing stuff, these short pieces for the print magazine, and increasingly over the years we've started to use them for the web. And I used them a lot for the science section because I wanted the work, and they were people who were interested in doing things, and I could sort of teach them how to do the science part of it, and we have more room, and we're putting out as many stories in a day as the print magazine puts out in a month, so you can imagine there's kind of the internet is an insatiable maw when it comes to wanting stories. So if we could find something good, they would write it. So I spent the entire bus ride from my house in a complete panic, as you can imagine. I said to Christine, stand by, I'm going to the office. I will take care of this. I'm handling this right now. And when I got there, instead of doing any of the other work I was supposed to be doing, I printed out all of this writer's work and printed out, you guys have seen printouts, right, on paper? You know how that works. And printed out Christine's work, the stories that she had identified, and I sat down at the countertop with a highlighter and started going through each story side by side and highlighting phrases or passages that were the same or similar. And I found a lot, including in one case the lead from a New Yorker story and one of our stories, and some other individual passages. Also found the same sources used, which is a little bit dicier because I've found sources from other clips. I'm sure you have too. Some structural things that were maybe the same, but probably the way I would have told the story too. But it was the lead especially, and then some phrasing that was close. It was the lead that did it for me. So I took those, and I went to our head of research, who was the head of research when you were there too, Joanna, who runs our fact check desk, and said, I need you in an office, because she and I both just have cubicles, like come. And Joanna has known me for a long time and could see from the look on my face that there was something wrong. So she said, okay. We went in and I put down the highlighted copies of these 6 articles that I now had in front of her. I said, we have a problem. And she looked at them and, can I curse on live streams? Does it matter? She looked at them and said, oh shit. And I said, yes, that is exactly right. So we both split off to do 2 separate things. I went to go tell the person who runs the whole organization and who was out, I think. So I sent him a note. I sent an email to the woman who was directly supervising the person who wrote the stories for us. And I went to tell the person who at the time was running the website and said, this is a problem that we now have. This is happening. And Joanna is looking into it. What Joanna was doing was getting everything that our writer had written for us and running it through plagiarism comparison websites and comparing it against other things that Christine Larson had written, running it through Nexus, basically trying to find the extent of the problem. At this point, Nick, the person who wrote for us, was named Nick. At this point, Nick had not written anything for the print magazine. He had a green light on something that he was working on, but again, because of the nature of how we work, because of the time, it hadn't run. And even if it had, it would have gone through our fact check process, which is to say that it would have come out and a fact checker who sits at Joanna's desk would have asked him what his sources for it were and checked for accuracy, and with as much primary sourcing as that fact checker could get, would have called or emailed original sources who he had talked to, but also would have had in front of, because of a simple Google, would have had in front of him or her the source material. On the web, we don't fact check everything. In fact, we fact check very little. We don't have the staff to do it, and we operated a little bit more in the faster and looser mode of a newspaper, which is to say, we put the onus for fact checking on our writers, which in this case, you can see got us in trouble. What Nick had done was taken ideas from other publications, which is actually kind of okay. I do that, you do that, especially publications that are more niche or that don't have an overlap. He used those ideas and covered, and taken sources from those stories, which again, kind of okay. That's how you start. well, this is the person I can call. I've read this person. I'm going to ask that person when I call them, who else should I talk to? I'm going to read what that person has written. I'm going to try to find some other approach with that person. But we do that too. What he had not done was advance the ball, I guess. I use sports metaphors even though I'm terrible at any kind of sport. It's a weird habit, but it's a thing that happens in newsrooms, I guess. The stories weren't getting advanced. And he was using language from those other stories directly, which is catastrophic, right? The things that you were learning here are all important, but fundamentally, we really only have two jobs. We have to get stuff right, we have to tell the truth, and we have to attribute our sources. We have to say where we got it. Everything else is kind of icing. Granted, there's a lot of icing on the cupcake that I just described. There's style, and there's panache, and there's exclusives, and there's scoops, and there's creative reporting. There's writing in a way that people are going to find elegant or beautiful. But fundamentally, that's all we're supposed to do. Fundamentally, that's what the Bill of Rights is guaranteeing our right to do. You know, that's both our privilege and our obligation. And that's what Nick had missed. So by now I'm in a panic, because now I know that on my website there are at least 3 things, and Joanna found a bunch more examples, that are plagiarized. So I went to the managing editor, it's not her exact title, but that's essentially who she is, who runs kind of operations. And I explained to her what was going on. And I said, this is what I want to do. I want to throw him out right now. Like he's done. I don't want an explanation. I don't want a hearing. I don't want any of those things. He's fired today. And if anybody asks us what's going on, I want to tell them. And that was controversial. Organizations, as you will probably find, tend to be very conservative in admitting wrongdoing, even if there's not fault, or if they can ascribe fault to one lone individual. We didn't even know what to do with the stories. We didn't have a procedure in place. So the question was, what do we do? Do we delete them? You can't delete stuff off the internet, especially in journalism. I mean, the internet doesn't allow you to delete stuff, for one thing. But also, that's not fair. You can't put something down a memory hole, pretend it didn't happen. Somebody suggested, what if we left the headline in the deck, the display copy, but then deleted the story? Which was like an interesting idea, but didn't seem to accomplish any of the goals that we wanted to accomplish. And the thing that I kept saying at the time was, we have to be transparent about what's going on. We have to acknowledge that these stories have problems, and we have to tell people what we did. And ultimately that prevailed. What we did is, at the top of the stories, I think we identified 4 that were real problems. At the top of those stories, we added an update that said, it was like, editor's note, this story does not meet Wired's editorial standards for truth, or I can't remember the exact phrasing, but we came up with a phrasing that basically said, we're retracting this story. This is not, don't read this. And we put it at the top, like, this story's not okay, but we're leaving it up because we want to make sure that you know that it's not okay. Now, in doing that, I knew what was going to happen. What was going to happen was that someone was going to call us. Another reporter was going to call us. And I even actually kind of knew who. There are a lot of people covering media. It's an easy thing. Easy, that's not the right word. It's possible to cover the media without ever leaving your house, because you can consume it, right? So there are media reporters, and some of them are great and some of them are not. But I knew specifically that there was a website called Retraction Watch. You know about this website? Retraction Watch is genius. Retraction Watch is run primarily by a guy named Ivan Oransky. Ivan is a physician by training. He's also a journalist. He's a great medical journalist. And he started these 2 websites, Retraction Watch and, do you remember the other one? He's got another one. And all Retraction Watch was designed to do was shine lights on retractions, both in the mass media and primarily in science, in journals as well. Because you think that, like, a newspaper or a magazine doesn't like to admit they're retracting a story. Boy, scientific journals hate to admit that. It's really embarrassing for them. So they kind of try to hide it. They won't admit that they've done it. They'll do it really quietly. So he was trying to open the book on that. And I knew that Ivan was going to notice, because he's got a Google alert for the word retraction, essentially. And what I told my people in my office was, they're going to call. And when they do, I'm going to tell them everything that happened. I'm going to use everybody's name. I'm going to explain what we did. I'm going to tell them how it happened. Because that is what we owe readers. That's what we owe our audience. That's what we owe our profession. We made a mistake. Now, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't Sarah Fallon's fault who managed Nick. It wasn't Joanna's fault on the research desk. But the organization had made a mistake. We plagiarized stories. And I'll say separately, so in addition to having been Nick's editor, I've also edited 2 features by Jonah Lehr and 1 story by Mike Daisey. So it's possible that in the Murder, She Wrote vein, maybe this is my fault. Maybe I did it. I'm saying this, I'm getting sort of blank. You know who Jonah Lehr is?
I would explain to that.
You can raise hands if you know who Jonah Lehr is. All right, you guys. When we're done and you go Google Jonah Lehr, you'll know why I blanch a little bit. Jonah was a quite brilliant science writer who'd gotten, I think, at least a master's. He'd done some postdoctoral work in neuroscience. And he wrote a couple of books, written a couple of New Yorker stories. He wrote a few features for us. He had a blog for us, a science blog. And it turned out that he was a serial fabulist and plagiarist, which is to say he was making stuff up and he was copying stuff. And one of his books, specifically, when people started to complain enough, especially scientists who he was interviewing, who were saying, essentially, I didn't say that. People complained enough that some basically freelance fact checkers went after him. One of the arguments that they leveled against him was something called self-plagiarism, which was just that he was repeating himself in his blog. I thought that was nonsense. I repeat myself too, repeating language and repeating ideas. But eventually they found a quote that he made up from Bob Dylan. Let me tell you, you know who you don't want to mess with? Dylan fans. They know all the stuff Dylan said. So they got him, and he essentially got thrown out of journalism and has since then tried to come back. I edited 2 features by Jonah, one of which had enough fact-checking problems that I probably should have suspected something was up, but I did not, because I assumed that it was the scientists who he was talking to who were being cagey, not Jonah, who's a super nice guy and a beautiful writer. And then the second story I did with him had no problems at all, and it was great. And it's actually still one of my favorite stories that I worked on at Wired, so it bums me out that it's a Jonah Lehr byline. And then Mike Daisey was a writer, a playwright, a monologist, doing kind of the same shtick I'm doing now, actually, who did a story for NPR about workers at Foxconn in China, the huge, it's 50,000 people working to build all the phones in your pockets. And it turned out he had made up stuff for that story. And famously, he did an interview he did it for This American Life, and he famously went back and did an interview with what's his name, the head of the host, with Ira Glass, who did possibly the world's meanest radio edit, in that he left in all of the awkward silences. So radio editors never do that, but he let Mike Daisey sort of swing on the end of a noose with silences on radio. It turns out to be very good radio, and horrible because it was Ira Glass having to acknowledge the same thing that I'm trying to acknowledge now, which is the organization made a mistake because of this guy. So I was furious and terrified, and I told our people, we're going to get phone calls. I'm going to take them. Don't let the PR people take these phone calls. They're very nice people, but all they're going to do is say no comment. I want to explain what happened. So 2 things happened. They brought Nick into an office, and Nick did a sort of round where he talked to all of his superiors, and he was very contrite and really upset, which kind of worked on a lot of people except me, because I was really mad, because I've got 13 years in at Wired. And if I'm going to be if I'm going to allow my ego to come into full flourish, a lot of what Wired is work that I've done. The front of book at Wired sounds the way it does in no small part because of my style as an editor, my approach, the kind of stories I like to do and the way we phrase them. I've done 150 features for Wired, maybe, 100 and something, let's say. I've been involved in our big cover packages. I've pitched those. The things that Wired is are in some part because of me. And so when someone threatens that, when someone makes it possible for someone to say, oh, Wired is a corrupt journalistic organization, which is what happens if you have plagiarism, especially the second time, because we had Jonah, that offends me. And so I was not a nice person to Nick when I talked to him. Then Ivan called me, which I knew was going to happen. And he said, will you talk to one of my reporters? And because I am old, and because I am friends with Ivan, and because I feel like I've been doing this long enough that I deserve Cadillac treatment, I said, Ivan, I tell you what, I will talk to you on the record, but you have to do the interview. I wanted him to do it because I knew he would know how to do it, and I felt like that's what I wanted. And he said, okay, because he was going to get me on the record. He didn't think he was going to get me on the record. He thought I might talk on background or something. And I sort of feel like as a journalist, that's kind of BS, right? Like that frustrates you when somebody says to you, well, you can quote me but not use my name, or I'll tell you but you can't use a quote. Like, we don't like it when people do that. So I felt like that would have been cheap. And also I wanted a voice from Wired to be saying what had happened. So I talked Ivan through. I told Ivan the story I just told you. And he wrote a piece about it, and you can find it. I'm pretty sure that what I just said will jibe with that. It's been a while since I read it. So why did I do that? Why did I want to make sure that I was standing in front of a large audience and saying we screwed up? I feel like that mea culpa is part of our contract with our audience. What we do is not always that nice. If I'm in my darker moments, I think what we do is almost never nice. We're taking other people's stories and making them ours. And with some exceptions, if you're covering movie stars or politicians, there's almost no way for somebody to give what my wife is a bioethicist, what my wife would describe as informed consent to participating in what we do. When you talk to somebody and ask them questions and write down what they say and say who they are and describe wwhy they're a good person to be talking about and use them in a story, you're capturing a piece of them. And I think sometimes I think that there's no way anybody who's not a journalist or a very famous person can understand just how rough that actually is. And we do that for a reason. We do that because, and I hope you will forgive me for saying what sounds like hyperbole, but I really don't mean it to be, we do that because we're defending the Constitution. Except for the military and clerics, religious people, we're the only non-elected job that the Bill of Rights mentions. And I feel that responsibility, even when I'm writing dumb stuff. I've written I wrote a story that was 10 jokes about why the diving pool at the Olympics had turned green. I've done that stuff. And I am unapologetic about it. Part of what we're supposed to do is be entertaining and funny and smart and clever. But most of what we're supposed to do is tell the truth. And tell that truth even when people don't want to hear it. We've been doing a thing for the first, about the presidential election, right? For the first two debates and the one tonight, we've been doing a thing where we've taken our fact check desk and had them with the people live blogging the debate. We've been covering politics a lot this year for a bunch of different reasons. One, because the current president is on the cover this month and guest edited an issue. But even before that, we were interested in covering politics because this election continues to have so much at stake. Especially if you, from Wired's perspective, as an organization that is trying to cover how science, technology, and business will change the future for the better, we felt like these two candidates had very different approaches to that future, and we wanted to be a part of that story, of telling that story. So we've been live blogging the debates, and so the National Affairs desk has been sitting there, and we've had our field reporter has been actually at the debates. It's been really interesting, but we've also had basically the whole research desk, Joanna's whole team, there as well, having prepared all kinds of information in advance to be able to say, when one of the candidates says something, to say, that's not correct. Here's what's correct. I read this really interesting article talking to, I just learned I've been mispronouncing his name, Dean Beck, B-A-Q-U-E-T. So Dean Beck in 2004 was the editor of the Los Angeles Times, and today he's essentially the editor, one of the top editors of the New York Times. And he was talking about In 2004, when John Kerry was running, Kerry was attacked by a group called the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. Kerry had served in Vietnam with distinction. He won 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star and a Bronze Star. He served on a vessel, a type of vessel called the Swift Boat. During the election, a group of other vets came out and basically said that he was lying about what he had done in Vietnam. He'd been a war hero and then an anti-war protester and then a senator from Massachusetts. He was the Democratic nominee for president. And what the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth organization did was straight ahead lied about what he did in Vietnam, said that he had not done the things that he had done to win those medals. And what Beck said in this interview was, when that happened, we didn't know how to write the words, "That is not true." We didn't know how to say, "That's a lie," what those guys are saying about John Kerry. And it worked. I mean, it's easy to look back at long ago presidential elections and identify turning points that maybe aren't real turning points, but that was a real turning point in that election. So I think what you have started to see now is as the election has gone on, and I think this campaign's been going on for 30 or 40 years at this point, but as it has gone on, you've started to see the press change how it responds to what these 2 candidates are saying. There were moments when you started to notice places like CNN or the New York Times or Us outright say to someone talking or to what somebody had said, "That's not true. That's a lie. What you just said is a lie." And that didn't used to happen. That didn't happen in the last presidential election. That's within it's not just within the last 4 years. That's within the last 6 months. And that's what we're trying to be a part of too. It's why we did what we did with Nick, and it's why we're doing what we're doing with the live blogs and the campaign of the debates. It has changed even how we think about that, even though we always would have said that it was our job to always be telling the truth and stopping people who are not. Yes, ma'am.
What happened with Nick, your thing? Can I ask you, hold on, we need to have the microphone. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
So, sorry, we have a roving mic and
Yeah.
a roving live stream, so.
I didn't know there was a roving mic, or I would have stopped you.
So did what happened with Nick change anything about the editorial process for online content?
That's a really good question. Not as much. We don't have the resources to fact check everything that we put online. So it did change what we told the fellows, and it changed how much we used them in the beginning of their time. So they spent 6 months, and when they were really only working for the print magazine, we essentially didn't let them do anything editorially for 3 months of that. Like the idea being like, yes, come to all the meetings, see what the process is, get inculcated into what the room is like, and then you can start working. You know, do wax on, wax off before you can actually start doing karate. But because the web is so hungry for stories, I had thrown that out the window. I was like, oh, they're not doing anything. Come on, let's do a story. Like first week they were there, let's do it. And we definitely tapped the brakes. Like, no, let's have them spend some time and understand some of these issues, to not feel, because to the extent that I think there was an explanation for what Nick did, I think it was that he felt such a huge amount of pressure to produce stories that overwhelmed whatever he knew or understood about what good journalism was. Now, for me, like first of all, I put almost all that back on him, and I say, I don't care what the explanation is. Go do a different kind of job. You know, as soon as you decided to start describing yourself as a reporter, as a journalist, part of that was knowing this is not okay. There were people in my office who disagreed with me then and who disagree with me now about my my radical interpretation, my radically conservative interpretation of this. But I'm sticking to it. This is my church. Like, this is the thing that I am a radical fundamentalist about. And so I was radically fundamental about what we did. And we are, I think, sensitized to the possibility that the young people who come into our office do not yet share those values with us. And we try to be much more careful about articulating them very clearly and carefully when they come in. What else? Oh, right, microphone. I'm going to forget that every time. Sorry.
Oops. Hi. So for those of us who are teaching journalism, how do we keep your future fellows from doing this? I mean, what would you like to see us doing to make sure that this doesn't happen with any of our students?
That's a really interesting question. Did everybody hear that in the back? So you can be trained to affirmatively not do those things, right? So part of the training is just doing a lot of journalism. And everybody should have the space, especially in an academic environment, to make mistakes that are honest mistakes. I'd probably characterize Nick's thing as a dishonest mistake, as intentional. But the unintentional stuff, you know, there's a place, as academically, you can correct. You can say, look, this language is awfully close to this other language. And maybe you didn't know, but like, we don't do that. You got to change the language. You got to move a story forward. You have to find another quote. You have to find another person. I've made those kind of mistakes. I've made those kind of mistakes in print in front of a lot of people. I started my career at Newsweek. When you make a mistake in Newsweek, it's in front of 4 million people when I was doing it. It's really embarrassing. But it can correct. I think for me, as somebody who's still somewhat involved in hiring fellows, as well as hiring entry-level journalists, that there's a set of skills that I don't always see, even in somebody who's been working at another place, much less somebody coming straight out of a journalism school. I was just joking with Laura before we started about the difference between emailing for a quote and calling someone for an interview or seeing them in person. And it's so easy to forget how to do that or not remember how to do that. I just, tonight, after this, I'm going to the airport. I'm writing a story for the magazine. I don't write that often anymore, but it's a fun one, so I asked to do it. So I'm flying down to LA, and there's a person who I want to talk to who's at a movie studio, and I have talked to him before, and I had an email for him that I think is the right email, and I emailed him, and I didn't hear back, and I was sort of sitting at my desk and like, oh my God, how am I gonna get in touch with him? What am I gonna do? Like, I can't, if he's not emailing back, I'm never gonna. And then I realized, like, wait, he's at Paramount Pictures. Wait a minute, I have the main number at Paramount. Like, I forgot. I'm old, and I forgot. And I call. It's like, oh, telephone. And I call the main number, and Paramount Pictures, how am I direct your call? Ask for his office. I get his office. His assistant picks up. I introduce myself, say who I am, why I want to talk to him. Great. Send me an email personally. I'll try to get it figured out. Even I forgot to do it because I'm a dope, whatever. But like those phone calls, the reaching out to people and being in a conversation, in a full duplex real-time conversation with someone means that you will get stuff you don't expect to get. And that moves the story forward. Emailing questions means you will only get answers to those questions, and they will probably be written by a PR person. We just can't afford to do that. And my expectation increasingly is that every story that we put on the web, let's say, will have, like, you will have interviewed lots of people. I don't want to just see translations of press releases. And that's increasingly okay online for a lot of different reasons. Not all of them are just traffic pressure. A lot of them are speed pressure. Things that it used to be okay to take a full day to do if you were working at a print daily. Now the expectation is that just happened. We have to have a story up online about it right now. And I have increasingly come to think that not only is that not worth it in terms of traffic or money or ads or whatever, because of the amount of time it takes to do that story versus how many people will actually read it, but I also think that it is brand dilutingly bad. I think that when people read those stories at a place like Wired, where I have high hopes for the quality of our journalism, when people read those stories, they won't come back because it was a bad story. It didn't tell them anything they couldn't have learned reading it on The Verge or BuzzFeed or Fusion or Mike or the New York Times website or the Washington Post, all these places that we're now all in competition with each other. And I'd rather go out of business doing it right than stay in business doing a crappy job, I think. See, I mean, it's easy for me to say that, I guess, but it was a long answer. what else? I'm happy to talk about other issues as well. I will say that there are a couple of other. Oh, good. Well, we'll go there and then.
This is more of like a question on like how you got to where you got. Like, what would you give? How would you give us like tips on how to get a cool job like Wired? Or
Hypothetically.
yeah, hypothetically.
So I definitely came into the world, to a different world than you were going into. I'm sympathetic to that. It was possible for me when I was coming out of graduate school to call Newsweek and Scientific American and say, I am a newly minted science journalist out of a graduate program. Is it possible for me to come to New York and talk to you about a job? And to have both Scientific American and Newsweek say, yeah, come on in, we actually do have a job. Like, that happened to me. I got to choose. And I don't think the world looks like that anymore. I'm aware of that. I will say that the simple act of calling an editor and saying, I'm interested in work, will differentiate you from, I'm making up a number, 80% of your peers. I promise you that most of you in this room don't know how to do that. I think you should learn. There's a big difference between if I get an email or a call from one of you and if I just get an email, or if I get an email with a pitch and I've never talked to you or met you or had no idea that you want what you want to do. Like, there's that outreach, that is on you. It is not going to be on me. So there is that. I will say too that I feel very strongly that journalists are supposed to be smarter than the average bear, by which I mean it's really important for you to know the tools of doing good journalism, about how to call somebody, creative ideas about how to get sourcing. I'm a little bit more suspicious of the, like, I also know how to build my own website, or I know how to edit a podcast. I feel like that's to me, that's a little bit like knowing how to work the printing press, which is like not really my job. Now, all of us should know how to do that stuff. I'm learning how to do it too. You're learning how to do it. That's great. But what I'm actually looking for, maybe more, is a little bit of subject expertise. I'd like it if there was a thing that you knew about that you were already smart about, so that you could find stories in a world that I will have no connection to. I'm convinced that the one thing that's mostly convinced that the one thing that's the same about when I started versus what's going on now is that I was able to walk in to newsrooms and say, I know how to report about science. I've been working on reporting on the internet and on technological change. That was something that at that point was not, people were not walking in with as I would describe it maybe as pseudo expertise, because I was 23 years old, and so I wasn't really good at it, but I was going to be able to be good at it. And a lot of the applications, for example, that we'll see for reporting fellows, for new reporters, are, I really want to cover culture, I want to cover entertainment, for example. I would caution you away from that. That is, again, something that you can cover sitting at home looking at your TV screen and your phone. And that's not, a lot of people want to do that. The ability to cover business, the ability to cover science, the ability to cover defense, the ability to, like, think big about the things that you care about, the ability to cover education. The New York Times right now is in the process of trying to reorganize itself to stay in business and stay relevant. I'm confident they will. I think that the New York Times will always be there. But they're building individual desks around climate, gender, education, and there's one more, I can't remember. Think about that. They're going to restructure their entire newsroom, not around like the metro section, but around gender. 30 people whose whole job it is to cover that. That's expertise. And that's something that as a reporter will serve you well. It means you can think of new stories, you can figure out who to talk to next, and you can feel some confidence moving through a story. And you can be working on that now. All of you have a thing that you care about that right now you think of as separate from what you were doing in school. That's your hobby. I guarantee you that hobby has 2 magazines, still print magazines to this day, dedicated to that hobby. You are made to be a journalist for them, at least in the beginning of your careers, I think.
So I had 2 questions. One, I was curious what happened with your relationship with the author that was actually plagiarized, and what happened with the interview that you did with the media reporter.
The relationship I have with the author is with Christine is fine, and we're still friendly. I've actually never met her. Here's the mistake I made with Christine. I grew up at Newsweek with a guy named Brad Stone. Brad runs technology coverage for Bloomberg now. And some months after that experience, Brad sent me a note saying, "Hey, do you know Christine Larson?" And I said, "Yeah, it's a funny story. Actually, we had this thing, but I think she's tremendous. She's doing amazing work from China. I'm actually hoping that I can get her to freelance for us." And then Brad hired her. So that'll teach me. Damn it. Bloomberg has a lot of money. They can hire anybody they want. So anyway, that's fine. And who was the other person?
The interview that you did with me.
Oh, with
like
Ivan.
Backlash of that.
Yeah.
Was there any?
There was actually some good feedback. I got nice notes from other folks saying it's really good that you were as transparent about that. We think that's a good thing. A couple other places called, and I talked to a couple other outlets. A couple outlets called and tried to go through the front door with us and went through our PR people, and our PR people did exactly what I said they would, which is that they stonewalled. I mean, they said no comment, even though I had explicitly said, please don't do that. Please tell them to talk to me. So we missed a couple of those. The story spread out a little bit. The thing that I was the most afraid of, the thing I was most afraid would happen is that somebody would do what I think a good magazine journalist would have done there, which is said, okay, Chris Anderson, the former editor-in-chief, had a plagiarism eruption with his second book, where he had a big chunk of it taken from a feature story that he hadn't written, that in fact I had edited from Wired, that was in like the introduction or the first chapter of one of his books that they then sort of pulped and started over. And he said, like, total mistake. I had it in my notes, then I got confused, the usual thing that people say. And he got a pass on it. But that happened. We had Jonah, we had Mike Daisy, and I feel like maybe and then we had Nick. I feel like there might have even been another one. And if I had been a media reporter outside, I probably would have done a what the hell's going on at Wired story. It wouldn't have been fair. What was going on at Wired was all those things happened over 15 years, and they were unrelated, except because of me. Which maybe you could look into, I suppose. But that would be a good story to write. You know, like that would be a thing that somebody could have written. And that was what I was trying to get in front of. That specifically that story. I was trying to get in front of that, of some smart media reporter writing that story. Because all that other stuff was sort of like, there was hush-hush stuff about it. When the Jonah thing happened, they did an internal review of it, but then they didn't release the internal review, so it ended up coming out on Slate. It was a terrible idea because everybody was scared about it. When the thing with Chris happened, that sort of got, put down a memory hole too. And I was like, you can't do that. You can't do that. You have to be, what I said with Jonah at the time was, I want us to be totally public and totally transparent about this and totally open and honest about the fact that we are kicking that guy out of journalism. That is not acceptable. That is not what we do. Because if we don't, then they don't trust us the next time. That's what I was trying to get ahead of. I think it mostly worked this time. I don't know. I tire everybody out?
Hey, so would you say that the print magazine is profitable as, say, the advertising online, or how does that play in?
I'm not allowed to answer that question. I will say that, what am I allowed to say? I should probably have checked in on this. I think I'm not allowed to answer that. I apologize for being cagey, but as soon as we start talking about business stuff, I'm sort of not. But
is it just to, just to have something out there for people to read, or I guess.
So I think that the way that we think about print journalism right now is probably going to be totally different. I don't even know if it's a 5-year time horizon. It might even be less than that. There is still a giant audience of people who wants to read journalism. There are a large number of advertisers who would like to advertise in the places that publish print journalism. The questions are, what will those people pay and for what? Or what will those readers pay and for what? And it's amazing to think that that is still an open question, 15 years into the 20-something years into the existence of the World Wide Web. I think what the print magazine provides is, I used the phrase Fabergé egg a few minutes ago, and I think what the print magazine provides is a very specific kind of experience. And I think that there are still a lot of people who want that experience. And it's very different than the one that you have looking at your phone, which is another kind of experience that's useful. Trying to figure out what kind of stories go to which place and how to provide those experiences in a way that people will want them remains our signal challenge. And I'll admit to you, as somebody who spent all those years on the print magazine and now spends most of his time working on the web, like, I'm much more interested in figuring out how to take all the stuff that we are good at in print and do it online than I am in figuring out yet another complicated 2-page infographic for the print magazine, which I fear will not be seen by as many people. I have that's my own sort of thing that gets me to hunch my shoulders up now, is trying to figure out, like, really, I don't want to sit in a long meeting to try to figure out the headline for this print story when it's going to be different online, and nobody's going to see the art that we're trying to match the headline to. Like, we have to figure out this prioritization better, and that's part of what I'm trying to. It's part of what I'm trying to learn how to do. And I don't think there will be as many print publications as there are now. I think there will be outlets, and we don't know what to call them. In the same way that I get my hackles up when somebody calls what we put on the web content. It's not content. These are stories. These articles. You know, actually, I had a much harder time with content until I heard one of our business side people describe what we put on the web as inventory. And I was like, you know what, go back to content. It's fine. Content's good. It's whatever. Sure, content, you got it. They were describing it as inventory because the idea was they had sold enough ads against it that they needed more to put online to put an ad next to. It's like, you guys got to give us more inventory. It's like, I suppose it's a good problem to have, but I wish you wouldn't say inventory. So, you know, I think that I think there'll be fewer places doing that on paper. But I think that the ones that do it on paper will be super high quality. There's a little bit of a last buggy whip maker problem here, where, like, you know, at the end of the era of the horse-drawn carriage, there were 2 buggy whip makers left, and they made the best buggy whip makers in the world. I think that's from Other People's Money, the play Other People's Money. But I think that the Atlantic stays the Atlantic. I think Wired stays Wired. I think the New Yorker stays the New Yorker. I think. I'm not, you know, I can turn to be wrong tomorrow. But there's an experience of those organizations delivered in that medium that I think stays. I will say on the other, I'm going on a length, you can tell this is when I wake up in the middle of the night, this is the stuff I worry about. I will say that the print magazine may have always just been a technological aberration. Because we were born when we think of the print magazine as being just a permanent fixture of the media landscape. But the print magazine as we have it is really only about 100 years old, and maybe less. And it was really just there. It was really designed as a way to deliver photography, especially color photography, as quickly as possible to human beings before there was television. And when all they had were newspapers, which, like, had engravings and then later photographs. So the question was, well, how do you do that? And it was like, well, we can only, the fastest we can do that is roughly once a month. And this is kind of the format we can mail that in, because we're going to send it via the postal service. And how many pages does one story want to be? It's about this long. That's about 4,000, 5,000 words, really. Like, the whole idea of the print magazine feature was just a response to technological challenges of the era that then became reified, that then became the way you do a print magazine. Now, those challenges are over now. You want to deliver a color photograph to somebody? That's real easy right now. You can all do that right now. You can deliver that to however many people follow you on Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook. So once those technological strictures are lifted, what's the response to use those new technologies to deliver quality journalism? I think that what we think of as quality journalism can be disconnected from the medium. The medium isn't what made it quality. The amount of time it took was maybe one of the things. But you can build that into the web too. And we're working on building that now. We're working on a system where there are stories that we execute in an hour, and there are stories that we execute in 6 weeks, with a lot more editing, and a lot more reporting, and a lot more thinking, a lot more art. And that, you can do that on the web. People will read them. People like long stuff on the web. The question is, how do you find the money and resources to fund doing that? And those are all the problems that we're trying to deal with now.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of answered it just now, but my question was just going to be so you're talking about how the medium, I guess, shaped the way that the content was created and provided. And I think that's, I don't know, my impression is that the web still influences the length even of a story, the content of the story, the way that it's presented. And I've heard some people say that content or articles have gotten way shorter because of attention spans that are it's kind of like this catch-22 where people's attention spans are shorter, and there's a lot more competition for eyes, and so you just want to get 200 words out or whatever.
Well, I mean, here's my intuition about that. I will say that on the Wired website, at least, a story that's 200 words long does no traffic at all. It looks terrible. People don't want to read it. They feel like they're getting ripped off if they click to it. What we used to do, what we do in the print front of book right now, has no life. That's not true. I'm exaggerating for effect, but has very limited life online. 150 words just it disappears on a screen. I think maybe, this is intuition. I don't have a lot of good numbers for this, but I think what might be happening is that what's disappearing is the 3,000 word story, the 4,000 word, a magazine feature, like what we would all think of as like a magazine feature. 4,000 words, great assignment. Wired magazine, print, you get assigned 4,000 words, get maybe 250 a word. That's pretty good, right? And it's going to be marquee, and the art's going to be beautiful, and some really good editors are going to just rip into the thing, and it's going to be great, and it's going to be a really good clip. I think that 4,000 word length, that's just what print magazines do. But like 10,000 words is something the web can do. And 800 words is something the web can do. I think most of the stories that we run on Wired.com have kind of a life as like, there's sort of a 500 word version, there's an 800 word story, there's 1,000 word, there's 1,200. As they start to get into 1,800 words, I start to think maybe that's too long for what those stories tend to be. And then we're doing stuff that's longer on the web. Or we're doing things that are like video and galleries, and I don't denigrate that at all. I have some suspicion that the craze for online video is entirely driven by what advertisers are willing to pay, and that it may go away, which is going to be really embarrassing for all of us who built out really big video departments. If that happens, because you're like, oh, what do those guys do? But it's also possible that stays forever, and that you end up with places being successful if they are multimedia platforms. If the New York Times or Wired, if you say, well, what is Wired? Wired is a place that publishes a magazine that has video on its own, that does video on Facebook, that publishes a lot of things on Facebook and through Twitter and through whatever's coming next, and that has its own website to which social drives readers, and also to which people go of their own to go look at a homepage and then go out from there. Like that's what we're trying to do. I don't know if it is gonna be super successful.
One thing I would say on that is also just the experience. The one thing that Wired, when you think about it, since I guess like I joined the staff 94, 95, that it's changed over the years, is it always kind of adapts to the experience. I think of a couple of reader letters. There's actually a whole bunch. I always recommend reading reader letters. There was one my father sent about the magazine using too foul of language. That was a bit embarrassing. But one of the person who read the magazine in the bathtub and was actually complaining about how the ink flecked off of the pages. And at that moment, I realized that is a particular experience that I didn't realize we were creating stories for. And also over the years, you did PBS Science through Wired. Wired had a book division, it had a television division. So I do think like there's just something where media, you have to think what's the experience, and that experience can change over time.
And so what's super hard about that, I think, is if you think about, you read BuzzFeed? Do you look at BuzzFeed at all? So BuzzFeed fascinates me for a lot of different reasons. They have an aggressive and very good news division They have an aggressive and very well-paid ad company that's making advertisements for people, and that's kind of where the money is. And they have this other stuff that they do, where like their pictures of cute cats were doing so well that there's a whole separate animals vertical because it was throwing off everybody else's traffic. Like they had to just put it over there and be like, yes, that has giant traffic. Great, we get it. So, and like BuzzFeed, nobody really goes to BuzzFeed.com, right? Like there is one. It's terrible. I mean, it's like not a thing you can use. You go to BuzzFeed because social drives you there, right? Because you see a link to BuzzFeed from somewhere else. BuzzFeed doesn't, there's no thing that is BuzzFeed. And so why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because it's a different business model, but it's also interesting because you have to ask yourself as a reader, am I a BuzzFeed reader or do I just read this story? Right? Like, are you engaging with BuzzFeed as a thing that you want to read the BuzzFeed take on? I would say like, there's a reason that CNN just hired all their political people. Because for BuzzFeed politics, the answer had become in the last year, yes, you wanted to read BuzzFeed's politics coverage. So CNN just stole it. And I think you probably, for me, I do want to read BuzzFeed's technology coverage because I know who does it. And for a while, they had a science desk that I was really, really worried about. I'm less worried about it now because I think their emphasis has changed somewhat. But they have some great science writers at BuzzFeed, in addition to the people who are just cranking out 17 toothbrushes that look like dogs. I don't know, whatever, like that nonsense, but that you still click on, right? You still click on those stories. And that's what's paying the bills over there. Those other organizations have a different advantage. This is all business stuff, and I've only just started to learn it, so if I'm wrong, don't get mad at me later. But like a place like Fusion, which has stupid TV money, because they'll pay for anything, or places like I guess Mike or BuzzFeed or The Verge that are getting kind of venture money and investor money at the beginning. What they don't have to do, at least at the start of their business, is make a profit, which means they can get a lot of money in and have a lot more people. I think that the BuzzFeed San Francisco bureau may have as many people as Wired does in San Francisco. I'm not positive about that. And I will say their bureau chief in San Francisco is one of my absolute favorite reporters. It's Matt Honan. He's a genius. He's written some of my favorite things I've ever read in journalism. So like he's great, you know, but it's a different kind of business than Wired being part of Condé Nast and having a different set of business responsibilities that, I keep saying this, that we're trying to figure out. That's what we're trying to do. It's horribly stressful. What else? Anything? Should we wrap it?
We can wrap it, although I'm going to make sure I'm not missing anybody.
So one last question.
Let's keep doing it. This is my whole thing. I can do this all day.
So I guess just getting back to like the, I guess, alternative story formats, or I mean, multimedia and video, and whether or not that's a trend. I feel like, at least in my experience here, there's a very strong expectation for us to know how to do everything. And I think that's kind of a generational thing. Like when you're hired, they expect you to know how to do social media, know how to make a video, know how to build a website. I mean, it's just, they expect it. And so I'm just wondering, and you talked a lot about how it's important to specialize, but I think that there are things that are pulling us in completely different directions. You're supposed to know how to do everything content-wise, like, I mean, I guess presentation-wise, right? Packaging, and then you're also expected to, like, I guess from your perspective, specialize and really dig into a specific topic. So I don't know. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, right. The part where you acknowledge your biases and what you might have wrong. The to be sure graph of my talk. To be sure, Wired has, as a legacy media organization, as we are now with 25 years in, has the luxury to ask for different things. We're not a small, scrappy news startup that needs somebody to come in and like do social and be able to shoot their own Facebook Live video and edit a podcast and also report, and in fact, do all of those things on the same story. We don't do that. When I hire a social person, that person's the social person and maybe writing stories, or maybe writing socially aimed stories or stories that come out of social. but that person is not also my transportation reporter. And maybe we're one of the last places that has that luxury. I don't know. I do think that there's a difference. I feel like knowing how to get usable audio for a podcast. Let's put aside editing the podcast, because editing audio is hard, right? And that is a specialty. But being able to know how to get usable audio for a podcast, or how to get usable B-roll from a little kit, and knowing how to do rudimentary HTML coding, maybe, or at least use WordPress with Facility or whatever. Like, I feel like all that stuff is maybe akin to knowing how to type. Like, yeah, you should know how to do that, because that's part of the job. But the job, at least if you're going to be a reporter or an editor, which is different than being the social person, or different than being the person who runs the Facebook feed, or different than being the person who is producing the podcasts. If you're going to be a reporter, the job is, I got to know how to interview people. I got to know how to get hold of folks. I have to be able to put my own fundamental introversion and shyness aside to go ask somebody who I don't know impertinent questions, even though they're going to be mad. I'm really bad at that, but it is the thing that we do. You know, like those, I got to be able to figure out what the lead of a story is and write it in a way that's going to engage somebody and want to make them read the rest of it. To me, those are fundamentals, and the other things are support. But I'm biased, and I get to say that stuff because I'm an editor at Wired. So I have some latitude that maybe that other places hiring won't. I guess maybe you could invert the thinking there a little bit and ask yourselves, which things do I want to be good at? There are things that you want to be good at because you need to get a job, and that is real. That is a thing. And there are things you want to be good at because you want to be journalists, because you like this, because it's important to you, because it's cool, and like because there was a reporter character in a movie who had an adventurous life and you want to be like that person, or because you want to right injustices, or you know, whatever the thing is that gets you into this thing. Like the skills that let you do that are the ones that you can feel you can take on board most deeply, I think. I know what that sounds like. I know that doesn't sound practical, and I do want to be practical. You know, I would like nothing more than to be able to have all of you pitch one of my editors, have that editor say, "That's a great idea. I'd like to give you $500 to write that for me." And then you can do that, and then you can do that quickly, and you can write the exact number of words that the editor assigned you, and you can turn it in on the deadline the editor gave you. Another thing that I promise you most of you in this room don't know how to do yet, because most human beings don't know how to do it. You should learn how to do those things. That's a good way to impress editors. And that then you can be making a living at this, because it's a great profession. It should have more people. It should have new people. It should have different kinds of people. I hope that we get to do that.
One thing I would maybe add to that is like kind of what you had said, well, I'm a science reporter. I remember thinking I'm really lucky that I made the choice to learn giving up PageMaker and learning Quark, and then deciding to move from New York City to Silicon Valley, even though I got out here and I was like, where is this place called Silicon Valley? It's not on the map. But I think it's one where you've got to, you know, what you're saying is I think part of it is the writing and the reporting and talking to people is still part of the basics. But figuring out what's the industry's pain point at that particular moment, even though that's going to change. But I do think, you know, having hired people, you're looking kind of like, yeah, we've got a hole here. And sometimes I think from a student perspective, it does feel like, oh, they just want us to know these tools, this or the other. But it's really the assumption that you also have the real fundamental skills for journalism.
And I mean, just as a contra example, a tool that they taught me was how to edit analog 3/4 inch video. It's not as useful as it sounds. Knowing a little bit about how to edit video, the theory of editing video, and being able to talk to a video editor and saying like, can you do a bridge? Can you do a T-cut here? Because I've got this one good half of a quote in this one. Can we find some B-roll to put over it? That's really useful to be able to say to my video folks. But certainly the actual, like my ability to edit video is worthless. The tools will change on you. They will. It doesn't feel like they will yet, but I guarantee it. I promise you they will. The tools that I use now are tools that didn't exist when I started. So, what you're trying to get out of that is a facility with the ideas and the language of delivering good journalism, not so much the ability, not whether you can use PageMaker or Quark, right? It's the ability to be able to talk to a designer is what becomes useful out of that experience, I would think. Okay.
Well, if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up. It's 4 o'clock. Thank you, Adam, and
Thank you very much.
everybody. So I'm looking at Sachi because our next discussion is 4:10. Is that correct? Yeah. All right. Okay. Thanks. Come up. Feel free to talk to Adam.
Feel free.
Face-to-face conversation.
No, come on. I want to